The Wyoming wind carved through the valley like a blade, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of another harsh winter. Ethan Mackenzie stood on the porch of his weathered cabin, watching the sun bleed orange across the horizon. His calloused hands gripped a tin cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, much like everything else in his life. 3 years had passed since the fever took his wife, Mary, and their infant daughter. 3 years of silence broken only by the lowing of cattle and the creak of old timber. The ranch that once echoed with laughter now felt like a tomb, its 2,000 acres stretching endlessly around him like a prison of grass and stone. Ethan's reflection stared back at him from the coffee's dark surface, a man of 42 with prematurely grey hair and eyes that had forgotten how to hope. The townspeople of Cedar Ridge whispered about him, calling him the hermit of Devil's Canyon. They weren't wrong. He'd stopped going to Sunday services, stopped joining the monthly cattle drives, stopped being part of anything that required him. To pretend he was still alive inside, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made him look up. A rider was coming hard across the valley, kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the still air like smoke signals. Ethan squinted against the dying light, recognizing the silhouette of Samuel Brooks from the neighboring ranch. "Ethan," Samuel called out as he reined in his horse. The animal was lathered with sweat, its sides heaving. "You need to know, there's been trouble with the Lakota. Chief Running Bear's son went missing 3 days ago during a hunting party. The boy's only 12, and they think he might have wandered into our territory." Ethan set down his cup, the metal ringing against the porch railing. "What's that to me, Samuel?" "The tribe's been searching everywhere. They're getting desperate. And some of the younger warriors are talking about raiding our ranches if the boy isn't found soon." Samuel's voice carried the weight of a man who'd seen too much violence. "I'm gathering the men tomorrow to help with the search. We need every hand we can get." For a moment, Ethan considered the request. The smart thing would be to say yes, to maintain peace with the Lakota who had lived in these lands far longer than any of them. But the thought of riding out with other men, of making conversation and pretending to care about anything beyond his own grief, felt impossible. "I'll keep an eye out from my land," Ethan said finally. "But I won't be joining your search party." Samuel's face hardened. "Ethan, I know you're hurting, but this is bigger than your pain. If that boy dies and we didn't do everything we could to help, then it'll be on your conscience, not mine." Ethan turned away, dismissing his neighbor with the gesture. "I've got cattle to tend," he heard Samuel mutter something under his breath before spurring his horse back toward the main trail. The sound of hoofbeats faded, leaving Ethan alone again with the wind and his ghosts. That night, sleep eluded him, as it often did. He lay in the bed he'd once shared with Mary, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around him. Somewhere out there, a boy was lost and afraid, maybe dying under the vast Wyoming sky. The thought should have moved him to action, but grief had crystallized around his heart like ice, making it impossible to feel anything for anyone else's suffering. He rose before dawn, as was his habit, and stepped outside to check on the cattle. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and frost had painted the grass silver. As he walked toward the barn, something caught his eye, a dark shape huddled against the fence post about 50 yards away. At first, he thought it might be a wolf or coyote that had died in the night, but as he drew closer, his blood turned cold. It was a boy, small and still, wearing the buckskin clothing of the Lakota. His long black hair was matted with dirt and sweat, and his lips were cracked and bleeding from thirst. Ethan's boots crunched on the frost-covered ground as he approached the unconscious figure. The boy couldn't have been more than 12 or 13, with the lean build of youth and the bronze skin of the Lakota people. His breathing was shallow and labored, each exhale creating small puffs of vapor in the cold morning air. "Jesus!" Ethan whispered, kneeling beside the child. The boy's clothes were torn and dirty, suggesting he'd been wandering for days. His lips were severely chapped, and when Ethan lifted one of his eyelids, the eye beneath was sunken and dull, clear signs of severe dehydration. For a moment Ethan hesitated. This had to be Chief Running Bear's missing son. Helping the boy would mean involvement, questions, complications he wasn't prepared to handle. The smart thing would be to ride to town and fetch the doctor, let someone else deal with the situation. But as he looked down at the child's face, something stirred in his chest. A feeling he hadn't experienced in 3 years. The boy reminded him of his own nephew, his brother's son back in Ohio. The same delicate features, the same vulnerability of youth. "All right, boy," Ethan said softly, scooping the child into his arms. "Let's get you inside." The boy was lighter than expected, his body dehydrated and weakened by exposure. Ethan carried him into the cabin and laid him on the old couch near the fireplace. He quickly stoked the fire, then hurried to the kitchen to pump fresh water from the well. When he returned, the boy's eyes were fluttering open. They were dark brown like polished stones and filled with fear and confusion. He tried to sit up, but Ethan gently pressed him back down. "Easy there," Ethan said, his voice softer than it had been in years. "You're safe. You're in my cabin." The boy said something in Lakota, his voice barely a whisper. Ethan didn't understand the words, but the desperation in the child's tone was universal. He held up the cup of water, and the boy's eyes locked onto it with desperate hunger. "Slow now," Ethan warned, supporting the boy's head as he brought the cup to his lips. "Too much too fast will make you sick." The boy drank greedily, water spilling down his chin. After a few swallows, Ethan pulled the cup away, ignoring the boy's protests. "More in a minute," he said. "Let that settle first." Over the next hour, Ethan gave the boy small amounts of water, gradually increasing the quantity as his body began to recover. He also prepared a thin broth from beef bones, knowing the child would need nourishment to regain his strength. As the boy's condition improved, Ethan found himself studying the young face. There was something noble about the child, a quiet dignity that reminded him of the Lakota elders he'd occasionally encountered in town. The boy's eyes held wisdom beyond his years, as if he'd seen things that children shouldn't have to see. "What's your name?" Ethan asked during one of their water breaks. The boy looked at him warily, then said something in his native language. Ethan shook his head, indicating he didn't understand. "Ethan," he said, pointing to himself. "My name is Ethan." The boy considered this, then pointed to his own chest. "Little Hawk," he said in careful English, the words heavily accented but clear. "Little Hawk," Ethan repeated, surprised by the boy's knowledge of English. "That's a good name. A strong name." As the day wore on, Little Hawk's strength gradually returned. He accepted more broth and water and even managed to eat a small piece of bread. Ethan fashioned a makeshift bed on the couch, providing warm blankets and keeping the fire burning. By evening, the boy was alert enough to sit up on his own. He watched Ethan with curious eyes, clearly trying to understand why this white man was helping him. Ethan found himself talking to the child, filling the silence that had dominated his cabin for so long. "You've been missing for 3 days," he said while preparing another bowl of broth. "Your father and his warriors have been searching for you. The whole territory's been in an uproar." Little Hawk's eyes widened with understanding. He said something in Lakota, his voice filled with emotion. "Don't worry," Ethan said, not understanding the words but recognizing the tone. "You're safe now. Tomorrow, when you're stronger, I'll take you back to your people." That night, Ethan made his bed on the floor near the fireplace, wanting to be close in case the boy needed anything. As he lay there listening to Little Hawk's steady breathing, he realized something had changed in him. The ice around his heart had begun to crack, letting in the first warmth he'd felt since Mary's death. He thought about his wife, about how she would have reacted to finding a lost child, Mary had always said that kindness was never wasted, that every act of compassion, no matter how small, made the world a little better. For the first time in 3 years, Ethan felt he was honoring her memory in a way that mattered. Dawn broke grey and cold over the Wyoming valley, and with it came the thunder of hoofbeats. Ethan woke to the sound, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle beside his makeshift bed. Little Hawk was already awake, sitting up on the couch with his head tilted toward the window. "My people," the boy said quietly in English, his young voice carrying both relief and apprehension. Ethan moved to the window and peered through the glass. What he saw made his blood run cold. The entire valley floor was filled with mounted warriors, their horses moving like a dark tide across the grassland. There had to be at least 300 of them, maybe more, all painted for war and carrying weapons. At the head of the group rode a man Ethan recognized as Chief Running Bear, his weathered face set in stone. The chief's war bonnet caught the morning light, its eagle feathers moving in the wind like dark flames. Behind him rode the tribal council and the most respected warriors, their faces painted with the traditional markings of the Lakota. "They think I'm dead," Little Hawk said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My father, he believes the white men killed me." Ethan felt his throat tighten. The boy was right. This wasn't a rescue party. This was a war party, come to avenge what they believed was the murder of their chief's son. Every ranch in the valley would be burned. Every white family slaughtered. Unless this misunderstanding was cleared up immediately. "Stay here," Ethan told the boy, grabbing his rifle. "Don't come out unless I call for you." "No," Little Hawk said, struggling to his feet. "I must go to them. If they see me alive, they will know you are not their enemy." Ethan hesitated. The boy was still weak from his ordeal, barely able to stand without swaying. But he was right and Lee. Little Hawk's appearance could prevent the bloodshed that was about to unfold. "All right," Ethan said finally. "But we do this carefully. No sudden movements, no surprises. Your father's warriors look ready to kill anything that moves." Together, they stepped out onto the porch. The morning air was sharp with the smell of horses and leather, and the sound of war chants drifted across the valley like distant thunder. The warriors had formed a massive semicircle around the cabin, their lances and rifles gleaming in the pale sunlight. Chief Running Bear urged his horse forward, stopping just 30 yards from the porch. His face was a mask of controlled fury, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "White man," he said in heavily accented English, "you will tell me where my son is, or you will die, slowly." Ethan stepped forward, his rifle held low but ready. "Chief Running Bear, I." "Father!" Little Hawk's voice cut through the tension like a blade. He stepped out from behind Ethan, his young voice ringing across the valley. "Father, I am here." The change in the chief was immediate and profound. His face went from fury to shock to overwhelming relief in the space of a heartbeat. He slid from his horse and ran toward the porch, his dignity forgotten in the face of a parent's love. "Little Hawk!" Running Bear swept his son into his arms, holding him tightly against his chest. The boy began speaking rapidly in Lakota, his words tumbling over each other in his eagerness to explain what had happened. The gathered warriors watched in stunned silence as their chief openly wept, his tears falling onto his son's dark hair. For several minutes, father and son held each other, the war party forgotten in the face of this reunion. Finally, Running Bear set his son down and turned to face Ethan. His eyes, which had been filled with murderous rage just moments before, now held a different kind of intensity. "You saved my son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave him water when he was dying. You brought him back to me." Ethan shifted uncomfortably under the chief's scrutiny. I just did what anyone would do. The boy was sick, needed help. No, Running Bear said firmly. Not anyone. My scouts watched your neighbors search for 3 days. They looked in the wrong places, called his name where he could not hear. But you found him at your very gate and brought him into your home. Little Hawk spoke to his father in Lakota, gesturing toward Ethan. The chief listened intently, occasionally nodding or asking questions. When the boy finished, Running Bear turned back to Ethan with something approaching reverence in his eyes. My son tells me you cared for him like your own child. You gave him water, food, warmth. You asked nothing in return, expected nothing. This is not the way of most white men in our experience. The surrounding warriors had begun to murmur among themselves, their hostile postures gradually relaxing as word spread of what had happened. Ethan could see the change rippling through the crowd like wind through grass. I lost my own family, Ethan said quietly. I know what it's like to lose someone you love. I couldn't let that happen to another father. Running Bear studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Yes, I can see the pain in your eyes. It is the same pain I carried these past 3 days, thinking my son was gone forever. Chief Running Bear turned to address his warriors, his voice carrying across the valley with the authority of generations. He spoke in Lakota, his words rhythmic and formal, clearly invoking ancient traditions. The warriors listened intently, their faces showing surprise and growing respect. When he finished, the chief faced Ethan again. I have told my people what you have done. How you saved my son when he was dying of thirst, how you cared for him through the night like a father. This is a debt that cannot be repaid with gold or horses. Little Hawk stepped forward, still weak but determined. My father, he said in English, this man's heart is heavy with loss. He told me about his wife and baby daughter, how they died from the fever. He lives alone now, like a wounded animal. Running Bear nodded solemnly. Yes, my son, I can see the weight he carries. He turned to Ethan. You have shown honor to my family when you had no reason to do so. The Lakota do not forget such kindness. From somewhere in the crowd of warriors, an older man rode forward. His face was painted with the symbols of a medicine man, and his horse was decorated with sacred feathers and beads. He spoke briefly to Running Bear in their native language, then fixed his gaze on Ethan. Grey Wolf, our medicine man, says the spirits brought my son to your door for a reason. Running Bear translated, he says you have been walking in darkness since your family died, but saving Little Hawk has brought light back to your heart. Ethan felt uncomfortable with the spiritual interpretation, but he couldn't deny that something had changed in him. For the first time in 3 years, he had acted not from duty or necessity, but from genuine compassion. I don't know about spirits, he said. I just saw a boy who needed help. That is exactly why the spirits chose you, Running Bear replied. A man who helps without thinking of reward is a man of true honor. The chief raised his hand, and the entire war party fell silent. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of ceremony. Ethan Mackenzie, you have saved the life of my son, the future chief of our people. By the old laws, this creates a bond between our families that can never be broken. You are now under the protection of the Lakota Nation. Any who harm you, harm us. Any who threaten you, threaten our children. A murmur of agreement rippled through the warriors. Several of them raised their weapons in salute. A gesture Ethan had never seen directed toward a white man. Furthermore, Running Bear continued, you will never want for anything while the Lakota live in this valley. If your cattle are stolen, we will recover them. If your crops fail, we will share our harvest. If enemies come against you, 300 warriors will stand at your side. Little Hawk stepped forward and took something from around his neck, a small pendant carved from bone and decorated with blue and white beads. "This is a sacred token," he said, placing it in Ethan's hand. "It shows that you are family to us. As long as you wear it, you carry the strength of our people." Ethan looked down at the pendant, feeling its weight both physical and symbolic. The carving was intricate, depicting a hawk in flight with its wings spread wide. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly the work of a master artisan. "I can't accept this," he said, trying to hand it back. "What I did, it wasn't heroic, it was just human decency." "That is why it must be accepted," Running Bear said firmly. "Heroes seek glory. You sought only to help a dying child. That is the highest form of honor." As if on cue, the warriors began to chant, their voices rising in a traditional song of respect and gratitude. The sound was haunting and beautiful, echoing across the valley like a hymn to the morning sky. When the chanting ended, Running Bear placed his hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You have given me back, my son. But more than that, you have shown me that not all white men are enemies. Perhaps there can be peace between our peoples if more men like you exist." "I hope so," Ethan said, and meant it. "This land is big enough for all of us if we're willing to share it." Little Hawk smiled up at him, the first genuine smile Ethan had seen from the boy. "Will you visit our village? My mother would like to thank you, and the elders want to hear the story of how you saved me." Ethan hesitated. For 3 years, he had isolated himself from human contact, building walls around his heart to protect himself from further pain. But looking at Little Hawk's hopeful face, he felt those walls beginning to crumble. "I'd like that," he said finally. "I'd like that very much." As the war party prepared to depart, Ethan watched the transformation with amazement. What had begun as a force of vengeance had become a celebration of life and honor. The warriors who had come ready to kill now rode with songs of praise on their lips. Chief Running Bear mounted his horse, then looked back at Ethan one final time. "You are welcome in our village always, Ethan Mackenzie. You are brother to the Lakota now, and brothers do not abandon each other." As the massive party rode away, raising clouds of dust that sparkled in the morning sun, Ethan stood on his porch holding the sacred pendant. For the first time since Mary's death, he didn't feel alone. The silence of his cabin no longer seemed oppressive, but peaceful. Little Hawk had ridden with his father, but before leaving, he had pressed a small piece of paper into Ethan's hand. On it, written in careful English, were the words, "Thank you for giving me water when I was dying. I will never forget your kindness. Little Hawk." Ethan smiled, really smiled, for the first time in 3 years. Tomorrow, he would visit the Lakota village. He would meet Little Hawk's mother, share meals with the elders, and perhaps begin to heal the wounds that had kept him prisoner for so long. As he turned to go back inside, he saw Samuel Brooks riding hard across the valley, his face flushed with excitement and fear. "Ethan," Samuel called out as he approached. "I saw the war party leaving your ranch. Are you all right? What happened?" Ethan fingered the pendant around his neck, feeling its smooth surface and the power it represented. "I gave a boy some water," he said simply, "and everything changed." The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and the distant sound of Lakota war chants, now transformed into songs of celebration. Ethan Mackenzie, the lonely rancher of Devil's Canyon, was alone no more.